Welcome, everybody. The title of today's Lovestream is directly linked to a white paper that we're just about to release. It is a development that we've been doing at our research facility, Color Intelligence, for several years, and we decided to publish it, to open source it. And it really deals with subject that's very important to us and to our clients, which is the subject of film emulation. Digital cameras have never looked better. They just have never had better dynamic range, better color rendition, better resolution. Yet, to creatives, to artists who are driving this industry, who are the number one of this business, these cameras appear a little clinical, a little cold, a little too sharp, a little not emotional, as they like to say. They are not necessarily able to understand why this is the case, but they're just, looking at its images and are not necessarily connecting with them, and also feel that the audience is not connecting in the best way with the stories and emotional, impact that they're trying to create, where they find that film, again, doesn't have that problem. It really works very well, to draw audience into it. This is maybe another, much bigger subject to why this is happening. We have a much better understanding of it, but what we're trying to solve here is we're trying to give these digital cameras that element that film has, and so bridge the gap between the two. And certainly, allow people who are geographically not near film laboratory, who, budgetary cannot afford to shoot on film, and also practically sometimes, the speed of shooting, the, level of lighting and locations don't allow sometimes to shoot on film. So digital seem to be like, a better option, and but yet, to compensate for the lack that we are talking about. So in this paper, which is titled AI-Driven Film Emulation, we've been using AI technology in a completely new way. We want to use this wonderful technology to help us emulate and not just generate. And you'll see how we have been deploying it, and as the title suggests, a novel approach to using superpixels, vector databases, and vision language models, which is all this wonderful technology that has become available, and now trying to put it to use for a cause of the best film emulation available out there. So like always, we're going to start with the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is that film emulation is typically measured and validated in a pixel domain, and what we can do is just a pure colorimetric comparison. And that simply is limitation that, we didn't even think it's a limitation, but, now we're just discovering this. Basically, pixel is being the smallest denominator of a digital image, is a triplet of an RGB. And if we are now just to hypothetically take a pixel of digital camera and then transfer that pixel onto film and then look at it back, we would find that we would be able to get these pixels to match perfectly when it comes to the RGB value. But then we also would notice that there is a lot of things happening with that pixel that our RGB doesn't necessarily measure, right? So that pixel would look a little softer, would have a little kind of halo around it. And we don't have right now any quantifiable method of measuring this, or we didn't until now. So basically, if we did a test, and we would take like a digital source, we transfer this on film, and then we would say, okay, let's try now to emulate the digital source to that film transform. We would be able to get to an incredibly close result. Well, in the RGB domain, right? You would look at these two images and you would say, well, they look very close, right? In terms of the colorimetry. right? And but if we were to zoom in a little bit more, we would find that RGB matched image actually gets this kind of little bit filming skin tones. But if we then go back to that film scan original transfer, we would notice that there is a lot of things missing. And all these things that are missing is something that we try to quantify and we try to measure, and then we try to put into some sort of, container that we can then use for analysis, simply for the reason that then helps us create better film emulation, that we can actually measure the difference between the two. So what are these things that are missing currently in an RGB pixel? So number one, we know that there is the level of NPS, or noise power spectrum. This is how we kind of digitally, it's the best way how to measure the grain. There is a grain in film, and we need to understand how that grain is distributed through the frequencies, how it's distributed from frame to frame, what happens. We also need to understand the granularity, right? So that basically means that it's not just how that grain is distributed, but how perceptually this grain appears to the viewer. Another thing that we also noticed, which is a big difference between film and digital, is the cross-channel correlation. What that means is that um, basically in a film, because we use different emulsions that and light kind of passes through all of the emulsion, there is a certain crosstalk that is part of the film design. Apparently, it's not necessarily an accident, and that has a very interesting effect. And also, like because the dyes in film don't not just change color, they also change the luminance as well. There is like a little correlation there, and that is not something that we observe necessarily in digital, and we believe it's an important factor that should be monitored and understood. The next thing, which kind of, is never mentioned, and very rarely is like being discussed as a part of the film emulation process, is the SFR, or spatial frequency response. There is a huge difference once we start measuring those values between digital and film, probably one of the biggest ones, and one that gives us very quickly the most pleasing result when we try to emulate, even without manipulating the RGB values themselves. And then as a part of that, we go to the modulation transfer function. Yes, this is not, MTF is not just a part of optical lenses. It is in film, and digital and film have got definitely different values, and they play a huge and important role in overall perception. And last but certainly not least is the fact that they're time-based variation. That means that film changes from frame to frame. And that's really what is so important. So at the macro level, what we want to kind of see and analyze and understand is that we deal in one end with the digital cameras that are pixels, that are like a RGB pixels, and a very hard surface that lights hits and bounces off sometimes as well. And then on the other side, we have this fine silver halide crystals embedded in emulsion that reacts completely differently to the energy of light, spreads and activates in a different way, and they just behave differently. They just behave differently, and we don't want to just kind of guess how differently they behave. We really want to have a very strong quantifiable method of understanding how that reflects to the overall image. And we can certainly conclude that RGB pixels right now don't have all the information that we need to emulate film correctly. When we scan RGB pixel back, like you saw it at the beginning, the scan, yes, certainly we can do and match the RGB values perfectly, but all that extra information to what happened with that pixel is completely missing. And We are only able to kind of estimate, to, what we call eyeball right now. It's very hard to measure. No vectorscope, waveform monitor, or histogram is really equipped to help us with that. So how to solve this problem? Well, interestingly, there is this technology called Superpixels that is used slightly differently, but it's one that really works. So what we actually had to do, instead of just going, to micro level to kind of just one pixel, we have to go and zoom out a little bit and analyze an area of an image. And in our case, we found that area of 128 by 128 pixel is sufficient. And that superpixel is basically an area that we use as a smallest denominator to start doing this analysis that is necessary for us to come to a quantifiable results. Okay, so what are superpixels? Now, in vision language models, in VLMs, they are used a lot. They're used, however, for a purpose of reducing the amount of data information. But for us, this principle also aligns with our goals, because we can basically use these patches, so to say, to get to much better statistical value. So we kind of thought this could be very an interesting thing. So what we then decided to do is we decided to go and take these superpixels, do a deep image analysis, and we're going to see exactly what it means and everything that we're going to do with every single superpixel. And however, what we're going to end up with after we do this analysis, with a huge amount of data. And analyzing the data and comparing the data is absolutely essential. I mean, that's the reason why we're doing it. And how to quantify, this amount of information? We decided to again use a technology that's relatively new, but it's super advanced, because all large language models that are the most popular types of models at the moment are dependent on it, which is the vector databases. But the vector databases do incredibly well is they allow us to create multidimensional vectors information. In our case, we're using 64 dimensions and 24 dimensions, and allow us to very effectively be able to calculate nearest neighbors, or the difference between different superpixels effectively. But also, what's really interesting, there is a already existing connection between vector database and large language models that are multimodal. So that means that they can analyze the data from that, vector database, and communicate in linguistic way, to what's really happening, and not just numerical and graphical. So it's a relatively new way of image analysis that we haven't had before, but definitely completely new when it comes to film emulation, and one that has led to incredibly important discoveries that have then been deployed in our product called Filmlab Ai. So now I would like to kind of take you a little bit through the methodology, what we're really going to do and how we're doing it, dive a little bit deeper into those details. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to build some reference data. So that's the data that's going to tell us, hey, this is really what film looks like. So what we did is we took and developed special 4K test image sequence. Okay, so some of these measurements cannot be done just on any images. We need the specific images, like slanted edges, grayscales, and color patches, and so on and so on and so on, skin patches. And they are then transferred from a digital domain onto a film negative using laser printing. And then we were very adamant that we wanted to use contact printers to transfer them to film print, because of the all optical element and everything that happens in that process. And then, we use then film scanner to scan that film print and send us back for image analysis. So that was the process that, we started. We used Kodak 5219 and 2398 as a print stock. And that was the starting point or the reference source for the actual film superpixels. So once we got this back, so we then started taking these patches and analyzing them and building, the superpixel structure. Okay, so basically the first thing we always want to analyze, the most important thing we want to analyze is the sharpness. And also like what happens with this optics block. Now look, this is not the optics of your camera lenses. There is an optics block elements in this whole process, right? You are introducing effectively certain types of optical transforms in the process of scanning and contact printing effectively as well. So there is a light itself is diffused through an element, so we know that there is a certain effect that we can measure and we can see. And this is, by the way, relatively well established method of measurement. It's called MTF50. So what MTF50 stands is at what value your modulation transfer function is going to be at 50%. Okay, and that's basically the measurement that you try to do. And so, for example, in digital, this is very high. In film, this is lower. Okay, and then we have MTF10. And why we need this is because we need a distance between MTF50 and 10. So these two values are derived from a same test patch. So this is a slanted edge image. And basically, but what we are really interested is not just one or another. We're interested in a distance between the two. That maybe explains the reason why, for example, in Filmlab Ai and LensLab, you will have a more than one slider for modulation transfer function, because that distance between the two is really what gives the character, so modulation transfer function is not one slider, basically. Okay, then we have another measurement which is called the edge acutance. So this is a kind of, think about it, this is more perceptual size of sharpness. Okay. Um, uh, yeah, so basically we take the modulation transfer function values and we run them through a coefficients that are standardized. There's like, they're pretty standardized. These methods exist, in measurement. And they give us kind of a 0 to 1 value, which is more kind of directly related to the perception of sharpness, right? So not just measurable modulation transfer function, but also like the perceptual side. So for example, when something is like a smaller than 0.3, then it's very soft. So when something is between 0.3 and 0.6, that's called like a kind of filmic, edge acutance. And then when something's higher than 6, we say, oh, this is digital, right? Okay, and then we calculate lens diffusion proxy. So this is basically the distance from the Nyquist theory. The Nyquist theory is a kind of ideal scenario of maximum, spatial resolution. But then we kind of step down in bands, and then we decide where we are, and the higher this kind of lens diffusion is, this is kind of the best way how to measure halation effectively. Like that this is kind of the best numerical kind of value that we can assign to understand how much halation has happened. And basically, so for example, if the value is between 0 to 2.4, is kind of a little bit lower, so it's a lower ratio, so that means it has a higher halation diffusion effect applied to it. Okay, so basically that is the first. So you see now we're having real numbers that can tell us, hey, what's happened with sharpness? What's happened with the diffusion? What's happened with halation? What do these numbers really tell us? What's happening there? Okay, the next thing, of course, is the tone mapping, the most important part of your image, like the kind of the real the real deal, you know. Now, the problem with tone mapping is that it's a curve, right? And how you compare one curve to another. So we had to quantify it. We had to reduce that kind of, huge amount of, points and detail into something that is giving us some values. Okay, so this is something where you probably, guys, if you ever had the pleasure to listen to Josh Pines' lecture, we have to actually bring him back to do a lecture. He talks a lot about it S curve. And so what we did is we said, okay, let's kind of find the numbers or obtain measurable descriptors to the tonal mapper. Okay, so what they are. So the number one kind of value is this kind of gamma mid. In film, by the way, what we call gamma is not really seeing gamma like in video. Gamma is that middle part that is usually very straight. So effectively, it's that kind of slope of the midtone. Around 18% gray. So this is really like what we're looking at, and we're looking at a slope. We're looking at what angle is that particular part. Then we decide, or we find at what moment do we get a knee, and at one moment, knee, and then what moment do we get the roll off? So these are the two changes that happen at the bottom and at the end of your S curve of your tonal mapper. And then also we assign like a shoulder to it. And then we also assign a strength of a toe to it, right? So we want to know, at what point it happens, what's the strength of that roll-off, and what is basically the strength of the roll-off at the bottom, which is the toe, and the shoulder, which is the top. Actually, this is a wonderful tool, that we built for this analysis that we're gonna, release as well. So you will be able to take any image, test image, and you'll be able to get quantifiable number out of this image, like a grayscale like this, and you could turn it into parameters that will then describe to you what it is, but also like think about in reverse, you could also parameterize this tonal mapper by using these things. The next thing then we did is we have then analyzed the grain or the texture. Okay, so this is separate from the sharpness in optics. This is not the same, right? So sharpness is opposite, is dealing with the spatial frequencies that are derived from the Fourier transforms. This is completely different. Okay, so what we had to quantify how the texture behaves. And so really this is the kind of the best way we feel to kind of to add a number to describe the grain or what is going to be. So first thing is basically the grain size, and that's basically a frequency at the maximum energy. All right. So we feed a particular type of an image, and then we measure, and then we find at what frequency is this texture most dominant. And basically what that gives us then, like a texture that has a lower frequency, means it's coarser, right? It's grainier, it's chunkier, and grain that has a higher frequency, it means it's a finer. So that's the kind of like a characteristic that we normally find if we kind of say, oh, it's 8 millimeter, it's 16 millimeter, it's 35 millimeter. That's basically primarily what you see the change in that kind of f peak value. Then basically we separate the sampling into bands, and then we compare the bands and we compare the ratios in those bands. So that is super important parameter because we just learned a lot about the grain. We understand, the film has got this wonderful characteristic to include like a really little bit diffusion effect because of the higher density in the highlight, and that's not necessarily the case with any film emulation. So we really wanted to have a quantifiable value to how good we are performing when we emulating grain in that level. Then we also, of course, want to know the overall amplitude. This is basically how much grain there is, right? Basically, anisotropy is a number that is irrelevant for film grain. You don't need it on film grain because that is a number that tells us how, in which direction, this grain spreads. In film is isotropic. That means it moves in every direction in the same way. But your digital film emulation does not behave like that. And you just spent $1,000 on a plugin and you realize it doesn't really behave like that. Anyway, so we need to kind of measure that as well. Because that's an error with a film emulation that is not distributed equally in every direction, and it's an easy way how to pick up if the digital is working well or not. All right, so the next thing then we did is we did another Chroma-Luma cross-correlation. Why are we doing that? Well, because of the crosstalk. So this is the kind of, when we turn on the look designer and I say, hey, just tweak a little bit here, the subtractive. That's why we do it. That's why we do the subtractive part. Why this is super important is because there is a crosstalk, and we want to have that crosstalk. And also, it's a very easy way for us to know, oh, this is just a digital and this is not. So this is just like a simple measurement that we added to it to help us analyze, that level of film emulation. And then, of course, the most important part of every image is skin. You will hear that most filmmakers will tell you, we love the way how skin looks. Skin is the most important thing. Why we love shooting on film? That's because of the skin. So what we do is we basically sample, the skin area, and then we kind of, create an average value for that area, and then we then calculate the variance in there, like so that means what like this is kind of like when we sometimes retouch and we say, hey, limit my gamut, limit my hue. Yeah, there is a little effect of that we want to kind of avoid. And then also, digital cameras are very kind of, strangely saturated in skin. That's what film handles really well. And we measure that as a saturation bias, which is a distance on the neutral axis. And that's very important to be done in the kind of the LAB color space, because then we can neutralize it and we can always, measure it in relation to the luminance of an image and the luminance of the skin. And then what we did as well, we used the, skin tone of Isabella, and we said, okay, this is kind of, our kind of reference value, that it's irrelevant really, what value it is. We just want to know how far from that reference is that skin that we were kind of sampling. It doesn't necessarily tell us it's better or worse, but it tells us just, whether, this simulation is, moving far from the desired kind of spectrum to where we would expect skin to be. This is just a kind of another a value that we calculate there. So that all of those now things we said, okay, we analyze this, quite a lot, you will say. Oh my God, it's quite a lot. we put that into a vector, and that vector ended up being 64 dimensions. Okay, so it looks like a really, like if you open it, it looks like just a little XML file with all these numbers inside. And then also, we know at the beginning, what we did is we did some density measurements as well. But we found that this is pretty consistent, so we're not bothered with that. It was just the first test we did, like a lots of like a density measurements just to see the exposure changes. But that's not necessary problem with digital cameras because they resolve the exposure really well. So we're kind of we still have these elements as a part of the vector, but we're not necessarily tightly monitoring those. And that basically is kind of, that information gets loaded into a, a pinecone we use. This is a type of the vector database. Okay, and then that was beautiful, that was wonderful. And then we said, but what about time? What about time? Because film changes from frame to frame, You really had to memorize and mark the frame that you sampled, because if you went back and you tried to resample the same piece of footage just from a different point, you were getting different values, right? So we said we need to really, there is that kind of element of change in the time that film gives, which digital doesn't have, and that has to be measured. Okay, so for that, we added the third dimension to the Fourier transform. So we basically have the temporal, but now we added the spatial as well. So basically, it's a three-dimensional Fourier transform where the third dimension is time. And we've made that one to be 64 frames. That's the kind of manageable size for the amount of analysis that we have to do. It's good. It's 64 frames. It would be great if one day maybe we can extend it much more, but right now this is it. And that basically gives us, things for how the band powers change over time. Okay. It gives us the idea of breathing and shimmer. What, kind of this effect is, so breathing is like when film has a slight kind of movement inside the gate. And the shimmer is it kind of, movement of the texture, that changes, this is both like in a domain of very high spatial and very low, temporal modulation. We measure flicker. And there is hardly any banding, but yes, there is a change in luminance from frame to frame. And then we are also seeing if there is any imbalance in a directional anisotropy, just for us to be able to see whether this is a real, like when you emulate film grain, you really need to know that it's spreading in all directions equally, because the digital doesn't really. We learned that already. And then also we wanted to see is there like the coherence between luma and chroma, which is in film is real. So what happens in film, the luma and chroma follow one another. So basically, like, when your grain changes, it doesn't change only in luma, it changes in chroma. And the digital grain doesn't do that. Digital grain changes only your luma value. Your chroma is consistent. Remember, we learned it's all monotonic. So, this value of luma chroma temporal coherence was allowing us to measure, hey, is our film emulation, is our grain emulation performing in that domain as well? Is this like a value as well? Okay, so basically then, out of all these measurements, you get an additional data, right? And this is the index for flicker, for Weaver. So you probably saw it in GrainLab. We added Weaver and flicker. And those values really come from these measurements. you know, and that's, you know, what's happening, and that gives a secondary vector, and this secondary vector is all in 24 dimensions. So basically what we have is we have, and you know, in databases you can correlate vectors to one another. And also we add another, that's not so important, we add another, like a, you know, just JSON file attached to it, which gives us a lot of metadata. So anytime we open any Superpixel, we can read when it was sampled, what's the source, blah, 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 blah. So it's just a lot of, like, you know, kind of human readable metadata that helps us really understand what it is. Okay, so now we got all of that. Now we've done all of this. We loaded it and we started doing analysis. And we said, okay, fine. Now we have, you know, this analysis. Let's see what's happening. How is this performing? What's going on? So, I have a little bit exaggerated, you know, these two films, but think about it like a, you know, digital and film. So we loaded some digital images, we loaded some film images, some tests, and then what we did is we looked at the numbers first. And then basically, you know, we definitely saw a huge difference in MTF50s. We definitely saw noise power spectrum in mid-band. We definitely saw a huge Chroma-Luma correlation, which we always suspected it's there anyway, but now we had numbers to it. But for example, when we loaded the digital, you know, files into and run them through the same analysis, we realized these numbers were completely different. So, you know, the MTF50 was, you know, much higher. That means that images were just sharper. You know, it had a, I mean, very flat, because it's not noisy really. These images don't have really grain. Well, they have texture, right? But not a lot. Basically, you know, anytime we try to emulate anything, any kind of, you know, standard kind of film grain or anything, an emulation like that, you know, there was, you know, zero coherence, you know, because, you know, the original kind of, you know, traditional kind of way to emulate film had only luminance effect. And then what was really cool is then we were able to say, oh, just, you know, connect database to a large language model. You know, this was done on using OpenAI models. And then we basically ask, hey, what's the difference? And then it would tell us the highlight shoulder curvature of the emulated clip is 42% shallower than the reference. That's, it was insane. You know, basically what you do is you run your new algorithm you developed for film emulation, and you just load it and you just ask ChatGPT or, you know, like the OpenAI model, hey, what's happening now? And basically just kind of runs you a full report, you know, explains you really what's happening, you know, and it tells you. And then based on that, you then go ahead and you tweak your algorithm settings and things, and then, you know, you run this analysis over and over again until you kind of don't get to a really good result. So this is where we got these, you know, incredible discoveries from. This is basically where the whole Filmlab AI, you know, thing comes from. And you know, you probably saw me use like a, you know, parallel nodes, right? And I know I would have never thought, that, you know, you should be using parallel, but actually they were finally giving us results that an LLM was telling us, oh, you're improving, you're getting really good at this. So to summarize, let's summarize and kind of, you know, understand. So what is the advantage of this method? Number one, we're 100% frequency aware. Okay, so we're not just analyzing image anymore, just in a domain of RGB pixels. We have a full, you know, frequency analysis. Okay, and that's not just happening in 2 dimensions, it's happening in 3 dimensions with spatio-temporal changes as well. So that's a huge, that's huge. The information from that is really what's happening. And you know what? I really, you know, I'm gonna say I was so wrong about film emulation. All my life I was just focusing on these RGB values. Instead, you know, it's just so obvious. Like, you know, you don't even need to touch RGB. If you take care of the frequencies aware domain, you'll be having images that will be looking to other people like completely film emulated. You don't even need to do much with the kind of RGB domain. It's just incredible, right? We also measure the cross-channel coherence. This is something that, we necessary, have completely ignored. We didn't have access to it, but this is a super important element. The texture doesn't change just luminance. It's dye. It's a color dye, and that dye changes the saturation. And yes, when you look at the vectorscope, it's tiny, but that tiny has got a really an important effect, right? We also have now numbers that we can assign to a tone mapping curve, right? We have some parameters that help us to understand what's happening with certain tone mapping curves. Like, right now in Look Designer, you can say, oh, give me, F3, F1, F2, right? But now we have some sort of understanding, where these curves stand, and better, maybe it's going to help us in the future also understand how to design better curves or tool for making better curves. We have non-technical way of data retrieval. I mean, you literally just type a question into the chat model, and the model spits out the analysis back to you. Now that's great as well. You see, there has a little disadvantage as well. I'll talk about it. And what's really the biggest advantage? The reason why we also started doing this, we now have an incredibly important tool that can analyze our film emulation, and not just ours, but others as well. I mean, how they say, like, we can go and run any film emulation tool through it and be able to understand, whether it's performing and to what level it's performing as well. And we use it primarily, of course, to tweak our own tools, but also, like, I think there is no secrets anymore, like in terms how well, some of these tools perform. There are, however, limitations. Okay. Number one limitation we have at the moment is that we are working with scanned images. So all of this data and everything we showed you is really dependent on that scan, right? The values that we read back are, produced by a scanner, and we know that from scanner to scanner, you get different results. Okay. So yes, I think, hopefully in the future we can do something about it, or we can do more things about it. But yes, this is definitely a thing. There is, some could argue, well, everything you ever see today is always going to be scanned, because we always distribute images digitally. Sure, but I personally would love to go to, like, directly, film, but we'll see. The second thing we have is we have only 64 frames temporal sampling. And yeah, it would be better if we had more, So certainly, like, that whole flicker and weaver is limited to that sampling. The YLLM is great, to go and say, hey, da, da, da. It can sometimes drive you completely mad if you kind of start prompting, but what's the difference? And it's kind of not getting what you're trying to get. You're limited to that kind of prompt quality and LLM. So it's not like sometimes, having a maybe more kind of a tool that would give us, some sort of measurable values, or, graphs or comparisons would probably be desirable, maybe because we used to work like this. I don't know, but sometimes it drives me mad if I have to prompt 10 times and still don't get necessarily the result that I want. The limitation as well is this, these are still numbers, you understand, like, but I find with any film emulation, ultimately you really need to put it in front of people and ask people what they think about it. So this is why what we call perceptual calibration. It's great, we have these numbers and they're amazing, but you know what, the bottom line is, when you do this film emulation, you put it in front of the creative, your client, are they going to like it or not? Do they think this is great or not? I mean, this is something that we don't have. I mean, the reason why we were still limiting the access to Filmlab Ai, we're just building it. There is some really high profile productions that have been using it, with some creatives involved in it that we value so much and whose feedback was invaluable. So yes, we're kind of moving a little bit in that direction, but until, this doesn't become a mass product, we're not going to have like a necessary general knowledge and understanding, how good this performs. And yes, we're limited, like all we had was 5219 and 2398. That's the only stock in the scanner. That's what we started with. That's what we kind of had. It would be amazing if we could now start loading different film stocks, it's different scanners, that would be fantastic. So, right now we have a reference values that are pretty good, but they're, not, as wide as ideally we would want it. So yeah, so this is my wish list, where we think we want to be probably in a year time, I don't know, let's see. But, I would love to be able to do some spectral and what we call a chemical modeling, like, without going through a scanner, whether there is a chance for us to do something like that or not, I don't know. Um, Also, I would love to have automatic film emulation loop, and especially if this could be a tool. So let's say, for example, you use Filmlab and you kind of build a profile and you just press a button and then you get a quantifiable kind of measurement of where you sit at the moment, with that particular film emulation you build, that it gives you some sort of, 0 to 1, 0 to 10 scale in certain levels and so on. So, so right now there is still like a kind of, you have to export images, load them, analyze them, blah, blah, blah. So it's a little bit, so yeah, it would be great if this could be just a, more automated. It would be great if we could sample more film, that's definitely something. And cross-modal extension refers to our, I really think that we need to go outside of the film for film, motion picture film. Yeah, I mean, great stuff's happening and stills photography, and there's no reason why we shouldn't really dive into that, so yeah, I think this is, because we're limited to the amount of stock we can get, for motion picture films. I think there's a wonderful, opportunity for us to expand. And I just really wanted to share with you at the end what really happened was that we were 100% able to completely emulate, and overlap, very closely our superpixels that came back from a film scan in comparison to the superpixel that we generated with Filmlab. And I suppose it's not, a secret to you. You probably, if you use this tool, you realize that you can get incredibly good results. So at least, this one kind of closed test that we wanted, we were able to evaluate and be able to get things there. But I hope that, we're not just building a copy tool. We want to be build a creative tool that is just going to help us to express ourselves creatively rather than limit ourselves to the original film. This kind of also another kind of, more philosophical approach to why the film emulation should be there, to maybe push the boundaries, not necessarily to limit ourselves to what film historically looked like. Thank you very much. I'm open to questions, so please, guys. I'm sorry, sometimes color science has to be more talking than doing, but I promise I'm gonna do more doing next time. Somebody raised a hand and I don't have the name. Sorry. Go ahead.
Hey, Dad. That was Peter McCabe.
Hey, Peter. How are you?
Pretty good. So yeah, when you were talking earlier, it's like the cadence of time and like your eye, you're doing about 2.5 seconds at 24 and 1 second at a high frame rate.
Mm-hmm.
So does your eye will notice, the cadence if you're repeating it every 2.5 seconds, and how far do you need to get, or would you interpolate it, to
Yeah, we'd have to be minutes to really be correct.
right.
Yeah, because so what we did for the emulation, we did like multiple measurements. So we didn't just take a one cadence of 64 frames and just repeat it over and over again, right? So we would basically take multiple measurements of 64 frames and kind of put them together. But I would say like it's to really get to kind of, a level where you're so random, that there is no chance of being repetitive. I think the best would be to go for a minute or more. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really is interesting. Really cool
Thank
shit.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Juan, you raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello, Dado. Incredible.
Hello. Hello.
Look, Dado, I'm in my first life. I was 20 years at DP, so I know very
Uh-huh.
well. I work on a lab. And no, just one question. You know that
Uh-huh.
an emulsion is made by several layers of little, medium, and wide grain. And this is the
Mm-hmm.
art of Kodak, of Fuji to Marriott,
Yeah.
the teeny grain for the highlight and the big
Mm-hmm.
grain for the lower light. It's something that you want to go in and that can change even the emulsion for the best.
So we basically, that is not our concern, because what we do is we let film do its magic, right? And then what we do is we emulate that, and for us to emulate it, we don't have to do it in multiple layers, because effectively, we make for every color layer the full spectrum available. In digital, I don't have to put it in separate layer, but I can just say, hey, for cyan, your grain particle size can be from this large to this small, and that kind of covers what they had to do photochemically. Is the reason why they're in separate layers is because that's the way how they controlled the size of the particle, right? So when they're building the emulsion, they had to say, okay, now the layer with this size, now a layer with this size, and they are separate effectively, but they are separate in such a small space, that basically in digital world, it's absolutely unnecessary for us to separate it. We just kind of understand that this is the minimum to maximum kind of potential size of the grain particle. And somebody asked me on YouTube, these are all T grains, by the way. This is not the classic. We can't get anything anywhere close to classic because the T grain's been around since 1980s, and that's the only thing that we can evaluate right now.
And that also the way you measure means that you can measure that in the highlight the grain is less
100%.
big on the shadow.
Correct. You
Okay.
measure, so you measure frequency based, and in three bands. And so yeah, so you measure you and that's done with a Fourier as well. So basically you combine the spatial frequency and granularity. So guys, I know this was a lot. Trust me, when we start doing practically stuff, it's going to become much more understandable and usable as well. I'm in my future streams, I'm going to introduce you to tools for spatial analysis, how you can transfer that frequency, how we're going to be able to apply it to our own images, and so on and so on. So yeah, watch this space. Thank you all for being part of this wonderful stream and for joining, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again. We're going to continue this film emulation journey series, so it seems to be going very well, and I'm also excited about it as well. Take care, everybody. Have a good week, rest of the week. Thank you, Luis, for the help, and I'm seeing you soon. Thank you all, and bye-bye. Bye.